When the private screening of the first Gambler TV movie ended, Kenny Rogers had about 10 minutes to decide what he thought before he had to walk into the room and tell everyone else. The Gambler, Kenny Rogers' first television movie, which aired in 1980, was, from the beginning, a project built on an unusual premise. The song The Gambler had been released in late 1978, had gone to #1, had won the Grammy for Best Country Song, and had immediately entered the cultural vocabulary in a way that few songs of any era do. The chorus, the card table, the old man's advice, the train at dawn. These images had become, in a remarkably short time, the kind of shared reference that people used without having to explain what they were referencing. Know When to Hold 'Em had become, within a few years of the song's release, something close to a catchphrase, which is among the highest forms of cultural penetration a piece of music can achieve. The question of what to do with that was a real one. The song told a story, but it told a story in the compressed, elliptical way that songs work, through suggestion and implication, rather than through the full development of character and narrative that a longer form required. There was a character in The Gambler, but the character existed in a few verses of lyric, defined by his wisdom and his weariness, and the advice he gave, rather than by any fully developed biography. To make a television movie was to answer questions the song had left open. Who was Brady Hawks? Where had he come from? What did his life look like beyond the night on the train? And what was the story that the song had been summarizing? Kenny Rogers had been involved in the project, had been more than peripherally involved, had cared about it in the way that people care about something when their name and their most successful work is attached to it. And the months of production had been the particular kind of engagement that film and television projects create, where the work is simultaneously present and inaccessible until it's finished. You can be on a set, you can see the footage, you can hear the conversations about what the film is becoming, and still not know what it is until you see it cut together and scored and completed in a screening room with the lights down and no one talking. The people in the room needed to be addressed, not in a formal speech, but in the way that people need to be addressed after a screening like this one, with some acknowledgement from the artist at the center of it about what he thought of what he'd just seen. The producers needed to know. The director needed to know. The network needed to know. Everyone in that room had been waiting through the entire runtime for the lights to come up and to hear what Kenny Rogers said. The honest answer to what he thought required the 10 minutes, because what he thought was complicated in the way that a first screening of a completed project is always complicated. The things that worked were immediately clear. There were scenes that had come together the way the best scenes do, where the writing and the performance and the direction had aligned into something that felt true rather than merely competent. There were moments where Brady Hawks existed as a real character rather than a concept, where the advice the song had made famous was given the weight and context that a full-length narrative allowed. These things were good, and he knew they were good, and saying so was straightforward. The things that didn't work were also present and also immediately clear, and saying so was more complicated. Not because the work was bad, but because at this stage, with the film finished, the edit locked, the delivery date approaching, there was nothing in the practical sense that could be done about the things that hadn't worked as well. The screening was not a notes session. It was a presentation of a finished product. And the question of how honest to be in that room with those people about the parts that had fallen short of what everyone had hoped for was not a simple one. The private screening took place before the public one, before the network saw it, before the press saw it. in the small, controlled environment of a screening room that held the production team, the director, the key producers, the network representatives, and Kenny. It was a room full of people who had all contributed to the project and who all had their own stake in what the finished film was. And when the lights went down, there was the specific kind of silence that falls over a group of professionals who are about to see whether a collaborative effort has produced something worth the effort. Kenny sat in the dark and watched himself become Brady Hawks. This is a stranger experience than it sounds. Performers who see themselves on screen regularly describe it as something they never entirely get used to. The dissociation of watching a version of yourself that is both you and not you, that is doing and saying things you did and said at a specific moment in a specific context, now fixed and permanent and visible in a way that the live performance never is. But the Gambler screening was stranger than most. Kenny wasn't watching a performance he'd given at a concert or on a television variety show. He was watching a character he'd inhabited for months, in scenes that had been written and directed and edited by people who each had their own understanding of who Brady Hawks was, combined into a finished film that would become, for a large television audience, the definitive version of a character that had started as a song. The film ran for roughly 90 minutes. When it ended, the lights came up. Kenny had 10 minutes. What he said in that room after those 10 minutes was, according to the accounts of people who were there, both honest and generous. He acknowledged the things that worked first, and he acknowledged them genuinely, without the hollow quality that praise acquires when the speaker is using it to manage the room rather than to describe what they actually saw. He talked about specific scenes, specific moments, the places where the film had done what they'd all hoped it would do. He said these things because they were true, and because they were the primary truth of what he'd just watched. He also said, carefully and without dwelling, that there were things he'd want to do differently if they ever made another one. Not as a critique, exactly, but as the natural response of a person who had spent 90 minutes watching something they were going to have to live with, identifying the places where the project had fallen slightly short of the ambition that had started it. The Gambler went on to air in the fall of 1980 and became one of the highest-rated television movies of that season. It produced 4 sequels. Brady Hawks became one of the most recognizable characters in the history of the television Western. And the question of what Kenny Rogers had thought in those 10 minutes, in the dark of a screening room before the lights came up, became the kind of private moment that a very public career accumulates without recording. The real thing that happened before the official version began. That is true of most things in a career like his. The public version, the chart positions, the television ratings, the awards, the magazine covers, is real. But it is not the whole reality. The whole reality includes the 10 minutes in a screening room in 1980 when a man who had turned a song into a career was deciding what he actually thought about what that career had just produced. He chose honesty. He chose it carefully, and with the kind of generosity that honesty requires when it's delivered to people who worked hard and care about the outcome. But he chose it. That's the part of the story that the ratings never captured. Not what the audience thought when they watched The Gambler at home in their living rooms in the fall of 1980. What Kenny Rogers thought, 10 minutes before he had to tell anyone, sitting in a dark screening room in front of the finished version of the biggest thing his name had ever been attached to. Whatever he felt in those 10 minutes was his alone, the one part of a very public life that the public didn't get. And in those 10 minutes, he found what he was going to say. He stood up. He walked into the room. He told them the truth.